Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for inviting me to speak on such an exciting topic as associations. Um, so we're going to talk about associations, but I want to put this in a little bit of context. I'm convinced that all of you are committed to the idea of association because all of you are part of churches. And what is a church? Well, at a certain fundamental level, a church is an association of individual Christians who've come together, who've agreed, covenanting together to meet in a certain place, to sit under God's word together, to take responsibility for one another's spiritual lives, to work together for gospel ministry in the particular place where God has planted them. This is fundamental to what it means to be a Christian. None of us are Christians by ourselves. While the Lord saves us individually, he saves us into an association, his body, fellow Christians, and he has organized us into these things called local churches. So if Christians should associate with each other in local churches, the obvious question to ask is, should churches associate with each other in larger associations? Now, at this point, all of a sudden, though, I think we get a little nervous. I'm just curious how many of you are in some form or another of a Baptistic church. The church that you're in is a Baptist or Baptistic church. Yeah, like almost everybody here. And if there's one thing that is characteristic about Baptists, regardless of which particular flavor of Baptist you are, it is that we tend to be independent. We are congregational. Now, maybe you're an elder rule kind of congregational, or maybe you're an elder-led kind of congregational, but one way or another, we understand as Baptists that there is no authority outside the local church that can compel the local church. No authority outside the church that can tell the local church what the local church should do. The authority of the local church is contained within the local church. I happen to be an elder-led congregationalist, so I would say that final authority is the congregation itself. Some of you might be elder rule, and so you've put the final authority in the elders. That's a different talk. I'd love to convince you otherwise, but that's not what I've been asked to speak on today. But it raises the question, if the authority of the church is within the church, and there is no external authority that can compel it, doesn't that mean that churches should just be independent? Well, this is exactly what the Presbyterians accused the Congregationalists of in the 1630s, 1640s in England. So I'm not going to get into a debate about like the Trail of Blood and have there always been Baptists. I think there have always been God's people and they've always been practicing the ordinances correctly. But as a historical matter and as an institutional matter, Congregationalists and Baptists and Presbyterians all began to organize themselves self-consciously in that way as English speakers in the 17th century. I had the chance to spend a few years studying this. This is what I did my advanced work on, and you've got all these guys, and they're wanting to reform the Church of England. They're wanting to make the Church of England not just halfly reformed, but fully reformed according to the Word of God. And then they get their chance at Westminster, and all of a sudden they realize, man, we've got some debates, we've got some disagreements. And there's this small group of guys that I particularly studied called the Dissenting Brethren, and they are arguing for congregational polity. And the majority of the guys at Westminster that are wanting to reform the Church of England, they're mainly Presbyterian. And one of their biggest complaints, one of their biggest critiques of the Congregationalists, who weren't Baptists yet, but a lot of them would become Baptists, they just had to pay attention to their polity a little bit longer, and it would drive them to the right direction. The complaint was that you guys are independent, and that's not biblical. Churches should be involved with each other, and if you're congregational, well, it means you're committed, in effect, to disobeying the Bible, of being independent. And the Congregationalists came along and they said, no, not at all. That's not at all what we mean. We do think that a church is complete and entire in its government. There is no authority outside of the church that can compel the church. But that doesn't mean that those independent churches can't cooperate together, can't associate together, can't help one another in gospel ministry. And I think those early Congregationalists were exactly right. They were right to say, no, being a church entire and complete does not mean that we have to be a church that is alone. Does not mean that we have to be a church that is independent. So what I want to do is just give you a quick, potted history of this. I want to lay out some biblical examples, I think, of churches associating together for the work of gospel ministry. I want to give you kind of a quick historical walkthrough of why you, so both biblically and historically, as a Baptist or Baptistic church, should be actively pursuing association with other churches for gospel ministry. And then we'll take some questions. All right, so let's start biblically then. I think we see the beginnings of church associations as soon as we have more than one church in the Bible. We start off with that one church in Jerusalem, and it grows and it grows and it grows, and there are thousands. And no, I don't think they are a multi-site, multi-campus church. I think they are all gathering in Solomon's colonnade at one assembly and worshiping the Lord under the apostles' teaching. But as you know, the story of Acts, persecution breaks out, Christians are scattered, and the first church, other than the church in Jerusalem that we see, is in Acts chapter 11. So in Acts chapter 11, verse 19, now those who had been scattered as a result of the persecution that started because of Stephen made their way as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, speaking the word to no one except Jews. But there were some of them, men from Cyprus and Cyrene, who came to Antioch and began speaking to the Greeks also, proclaiming the good news about the Lord Jesus. The Lord's hand was with them, and a large number who believed turned to the Lord. News about them reached the church in Jerusalem, and they sent out Barnabas to travel as far as Antioch. And when he arrived, he saw the grace of God. He was glad and encouraged all of them to remain true to the Lord with devoted hearts, for he was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and of faith, and large numbers of people were added to the Lord. As soon as you see more than one church, what do you see happen? You see that first church, hey, let's send some people, in this case, particularly Barnabas, to make sure that this is sound, that they, in fact, are holding to the gospel, but also let's send some people to encourage them, to strengthen the work. The church in Jerusalem sends basically an elder qualified man to the church in Antioch to encourage that church. As you keep reading, then he went, in verse 25, then he went to Tarsus to search for Saul. And when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. For a whole year, they met with the church and taught large numbers. The disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. So the church in Jerusalem sends Barnabas to encourage the church in Antioch. Barnabas then goes and finds another elder qualified man, brings him back not to his home church of Jerusalem, but to this church in Antioch to continue to build up this new church. You keep going, verse 27. In those days, some prophets came down from where? From Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and predicted by the Spirit that there would be a severe famine throughout the Roman world. This took place during the reign of Claudius. And each of the disciples, according to his ability, determined to send relief to the brothers and sisters who lived where? In Judea. Back at the church in Jerusalem. They did this, sending it to the elders by means of Barnabas and Saul. We've only got two churches in the world, and already they are cooperating. Already they are associating. One church is sending elder qualified men to build up and encourage another church. He goes and finds another guy, brings him back not to his home church, but to this new church that they're trying to get off the ground. And then when they learn, because the church in Jerusalem sends a prophet up to them in Antioch, that there's going to be a famine, what does this new church do? They gather a collection to help their poor brothers back in Judea, in Jerusalem. like from the very beginning, churches, which are entirely independent, they've got their own elders, they got their own teaching ministries, they got their own thing going on, are cooperating together for the sake of gospel ministry. Flip over in Acts chapter 14. We're at the end of Paul's first missionary journey. He's gone around planting all these churches with his team. And in Acts 14, verse 21, we read, after they had preached the gospel in that town and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, to Iconium, and to Antioch, strengthening the disciples by encouraging them to continue in the faith and by telling them it is necessary to go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church and prayed with fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. So Paul goes around planting churches, but his church planting ministry isn't just planting churches and then leaving them. No, his team comes back around, having planted them, having seen them established, now invests in them more, makes sure they've got elders in place, and by example begins to teach them to be concerned for one another. We're going to see this later as we move through Scripture. But from the very beginning, Acts 11, and then the Apostle Paul's example, Acts 14, there is a concern that the churches know one another, strengthen one another, encourage one another. Of course, all of this really then comes to a head in Acts 15. There's a dispute about the gospel. What do we do with these Gentiles? And so what happens? Well, now lots of churches send representatives, and there's this whole council thing, and they sort out, what are we going to do with the Gentiles? Do they have to become Jews first? Can they just be Gentiles and then directly become Christians? You know the story. Now, what I think is interesting about Acts 15 is Acts 15, true confession here, I used to be a Presbyterian. I was ordained in the PCA before I became a Baptist. Yay, the Baptists won. The Presbyterians love Acts 15. As far as Presbyterians are concerned, Acts 15 is proof that we should have presbyteries that have authority. I want to argue, on the one hand, that Acts 15 is a terrible place to go if you want to talk about associations. Certainly presbyteries. Because there is a unique redemptive historical event happening at Acts 15. The church is figuring out, what do we do with the Gentiles? You never see anything like this again. They are talking about the gospel itself and its definition. I'm going to argue that Acts 15 is as unique as the cross is in redemptive history. That's a bigger and longer conversation. So in some ways, this is not a useful text. But I do think in other ways it is actually quite useful, because what's going on? Well, there is controversy. There are questions being raised, and what do the churches immediately do? They get together. They talk about it. So while I don't want to make more of Acts 15, I don't want to make less of Acts 15 than we should. While unique, I think it is exemplary. And of course, then as we leave, I'm going to leave Acts, we continue to see evidence across the New Testament that churches are cooperating with each other. So turn over to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 16. Paul has just given us this glorious chapter 15, about the resurrection. First about the gospel itself, and then about the resurrection to come. And then chapter 16, one of the oddest transitions ever, from the resurrection to now about the collection for the saints. Do the same as I instructed the Galatian churches. On the first day of the week, each of you is to set something aside and save in keeping with how he is prospering, so that no collections will need to be made when I come. When I arrive, I will send letters. I will send with letters those you recommend to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it is suitable for me to go as well, they will travel with me. All right, so once again, we see churches working together to encourage other churches and other gospel work. In this case, Paul is organizing a massive collection for the relief of the Jerusalem church, which continues to be under pressure, which continues to be suffering from extreme poverty, which continues actually suffering even from famine. And yet, everybody understands, boy, we owe everything we have to the Jerusalem church. Like it all began there. And everybody that's gone out to take the gospel, that finally got the gospel to us, well, one way or another, they trace their way back to the Jerusalem church. So Paul is eager for the churches to cooperate together to give relief to the Jerusalem church. And it's not just Corinth and the other churches that are probably participating there on the Corinthian isthmus. He tells us, oh, yeah, I was telling the Galatian churches to do the same thing. And we know there was a whole collection of churches in the region of Galatia. And they are gathering together, pooling their resources to send relief back to Jerusalem. Another example where I think we see kind of connectionalism at work. Romans chapter 15, there's a lot of debate about, like, what is this book of Romans? Is it like Paul's treatise on the gospel? Is it him like laying out in great detail what the gospel is and arguing from the gospel for the unity of Jew and Gentile? Absolutely it is that, for sure. But you know what else it is? It's a fundraising letter. He says in Romans 15, verse 22, "That is why I've been prevented many times from coming to you, but now I no longer have any work to do in these regions. And I have strongly desired for many years to come to you whenever I travel to Spain. For I hope to see you when I pass through and be assisted by you for my journey there, once I have first enjoyed your company for a while." Romans is a massive missionary fundraising letter. He has laid out his gospel, and he's arguing for their unity in the gospel. But part of the reason he has written this letter is so that when he gets there, they will want to send him on in the work of the gospel. And there's some evidence. If we walked through chapter 16, there's, I think, some pretty clear evidence. But there's not just one church meeting in Rome. There are multiple churches meeting in multiple houses in Rome. And he's hoping that all of them are going to contribute together for this gospel work. The other thing that comes out when you look at Romans 15 and 16, and we don't really have time to go through it all, but all of the names that you see showing up there at the end of Rome, a whole bunch of them we've seen elsewhere already in other places. A bunch of folks that were like associated with the church in Corinth, or the church in Ephesus, and now they're at Rome, or they're coming to Rome with Paul. It's clear that there was a lot of communication, back and forth, knowledge of, encouragement of, cooperating with, between the early churches on the pages of the New Testament. And then finally, just one little last piece of biblical evidence for churches associating together, cooperating together for the sake of gospel ministry. We could go to one of the later pieces of writing in the New Testament, and that's 3 John. So if you look at 3 John, verses 5 to 8, John writes, "Dear friend, you are acting faithfully in whatever you do for the brothers and sisters, especially when they are strangers. They have testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God, since they set out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from pagans. Therefore, we ought to support such people so that we can be co-workers with the truth." Who are these strangers that he's talking about? Well, he's talking about missionaries that have been sent out, and they're not known by this particular church. They're strangers to them, and yet they've welcomed them in. They've received them as brothers and sisters. And John is encouraging the churches that he's writing to send them on their way, to encourage them, to build them up, to support them, and then to make it possible for them to carry on supporting gospel workers. It's often in the small details. It's often in the travel sections that we ignore, in the lists of names that we quickly skip by because they're so unfamiliar to us. But it's often in those details that all the evidence of churches knowing and associating with each other is present. And if you just take a little bit of time, you'll see it. By example and by precept, like I just read in 3 John. The New Testament churches, though independent, they were churches in Tyre, there was no bishop telling them what to do, they were cooperating together. They were cooperating together to send out gospel workers. They were cooperating together to give benevolent relief to fellow Christians and to churches that were poorer than they were. They were cooperating together, I would argue, even in terms of holding one another accountable to the apostles' teaching. You get some evidence of that even in the opening verses of the book of Galatians, or you could see that in the personal example of Philemon. On the pages of the New Testament, churches are associating with each other. They are working together to make the gospel go forward. And it's for that reason that churches have continued to do that historically. From the beginning, this is what congregational and Baptist churches did. I mentioned at the top the Congregationalists in the 1640s. This was an area of particular study for me. In the 1630s, and it doesn't matter. My point is, a long time ago, in the 1630s, you've got these English Puritans, and they're reading their Bibles, and they want the Church of England to be more pure. They do not like the fact that they've got reformed soteriology, but they don't have reformed ecclesiology. And they are arguing, they are pushing to make the Church of England more like what the Bible says the church should be. And there's this archbishop, his name is Laud, Archbishop Laud, and he harries them out of the land. And a bunch of them are so persecuted, they're threatened with imprisonment, confiscation of property, etc. And a bunch of them go over to Holland. Because even though Holland is a foreign place, and even though they don't speak the language, and it's a hardship, they do have some freedom as foreigners to worship as they see fit. And so a bunch of these Congregationalists go over and they start several different churches throughout Holland. There's one in Rotterdam, and there's several others. Well, they're there for roughly a decade. The churches stay, but then a bunch of them come back because the Westminster Assembly is called. And some of these pastors, guys like Jeremiah Burroughs, Thomas Goodwin, some others, are pretty prominent. And so they're invited by Parliament to be a part of the Westminster Assembly of Divines, who are going to finally and forever, didn't work out that way, reform the Church of England. And this is where the accusation is thrown at these Congregationalists that they're just independents and that they're ignoring the kind of passages that I referred to earlier. And they write this treatise. It's called the Apologetical Narration. They are, and you can Google it. It's not hard to find. It's not even all that hard to read, even though it feels old. And they're making their case for congregational government. And in their defense, they actually are able, in this book, to point to the ways that they associated with each other as congregational independent churches in Holland. One of the things that they recount is, hey, we had a situation where the church in one city, we had a congregational church in one city, and the congregation and the pastor got crosswise with each other, and the congregation removed their pastor, but other people in the congregation kind of complained about it. They thought that wasn't done correctly. And so they appealed to this other congregational church a few cities over, and we work together to sort it out. A delegation of respected men, elders, pastors from this other church comes. They look at the situation. They hear all the parties. They have an open sort of, not a trial. They had an open meeting in which the various issues were aired. And as a result of this other church being willing to get involved in the messiness of their sister church, they were able to compose the differences, solve some of the problems that had arisen between the church and their pastor, and see that pastor reinstated in his church and everybody be happy about it. And they laid this out as an example. See, just because you're independent doesn't mean you're alone. Just because you're independent doesn't mean churches can't help one another. Give you another historical example. We'll move forward a couple of centuries and to America. Many of you all will know the story of Adoniram Judson and Luther Rice. They're in 1812, the very first missionary sent from American shores. Adoniram Judson, he's heading over to India, and he knows that William Carey is waiting for him there, a noted Baptist and an English Baptist. And so he is studying up on this because he, Adoniram Judson, is a Paedo-Baptist. And he wants to be prepared to meet William Carey, who's already there doing work. Well, on the long voyage over, he's studying his Bible, and he becomes a Baptist. This is what happens when Presbyterians study their Bibles. They become Baptists. He becomes a Baptist. He lands in India, and when word gets back to America that he's become a Baptist, what do those Paedo-Baptists do? They cut him off. Hey, we didn't raise all this money to send a Baptist to India. We thought we were sending a Paedo-Baptist like us, so they cut him off. So in the meantime, Luther Rice, who was his compatriot, also a Baptist now, Luther Rice's health isn't good. They send Luther Rice back. And Luther's job basically is now to raise support amongst Baptist churches for Adoniram Judson, whom the Baptists didn't send, but now get to own because he's become a Baptist upon landing in India. And so what does Luther do? Luther works tirelessly to organize support for Adoniram Judson amongst American Baptists. This would lead to the formation of what was known as the Triennial Convention, which was, like the name implies, an every 3-year gathering of Baptist churches for the support of foreign missions. An offshoot of that would become the American Baptist Missionary Union. So some of the earliest Baptist associational work was in support, financial support of the very first missionary that Baptists didn't send, but got to own. Now, history moves forward, and our nation is debating, to its own shame, the question of slavery. And the Baptist convention, and there's just kind of one, it was just all the Baptists in America, in the 1850s divide into the Northern Baptists and the Southern Baptists. And they divide over two questions. They divide over the question of how should missionaries be supported, and they divide over the question of can you send slave owners as missionaries. I grew up in the Deep South. I grew up in South Carolina. Born in Texas, grew up in South Carolina. I grew up Southern Baptist, became a Presbyterian, and then came back to being a Baptist. It's a long story. But the Southern Baptists got that question wrong about slavery. But what they didn't get wrong was, I think, the question of how do you fund missionaries? Because what the Southerners were arguing for is, hey, we should all be cooperating together and pooling our money together for the support of missionaries. Okay, they wanted to send people that they shouldn't, but they had a pretty good idea about how churches could cooperate together to make gospel work go forward. And the result, the Southern Baptist Convention and the cooperative program, it is arguably the greatest funding mechanism that America has ever produced for the sending out of missionaries and church planters and the training of new pastors. as small churches and large churches all over the country pool their resources to make these good things happen. 15 years ago, I moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. I'm not a native. And I found myself no longer a Southern Baptist like I had been in Washington, D.C. I find myself a conservative Baptist. I had to figure out, well, who are the conservative Baptists? Are there any conservative Baptists here? Am I the only one? Oh, bless you. There are a couple of us. So the conservative Baptists are kind of the cousins of the conservative resurgence in the Southern Baptists, only whereas the conservatives won their battle with the Southern Baptists in the 1980s, the conservative Baptists lost their battle, and they got kicked out. In the late 1940s, the conservative Baptists, it all comes to a head. They've been arguing with the liberals in the Northern Baptist Convention and over the funding of missionaries and sending missionaries that don't think Jesus got up from the dead, which is a crazy thing to do. And unlike the Southerners, the Northerners, the conservatives in the North lost, and they got kicked out. And they looked at the Southern Baptists, and here it is, it's the late 1940s, early 1950s, and they can see the writing on the wall. They see that actually the Southern Baptists are moving in a very bad direction, so we don't want to join with them. So they form a new association of Baptist churches, the Conservative Baptists. But what did they form this association to do? The same thing that Baptists have always done with associations, to fund missions, to train pastors, to raise up and send out and fund church planters. So that's the association that my church historically is a part of, Hinson Baptist Church. It's the old Second Baptist Church, Portland. Recently, though, we have decided to become a part of a new association of churches. And that is the Association of Churches on the screen right behind me, ACME, the Association of Churches for Missions and Evangelism. I want to tell you a little bit about it, having made the case that churches should associate with each other. We should associate with each other for the sake of missions and evangelism. We should do it because it's biblical. We see the normative example of the apostles in the New Testament. We should do it because it's historical. It is what Baptists have always done, because Baptists are Bible people. We saw it in the Bible, and so we thought we should keep doing it. And yet, here's the thing. Some of us find ourselves in associations these days that are not very meaningful. We find ourselves in associations that are supporting things that we're not very supportive of. We don't feel very like-minded with. Others of us, as Baptists or Baptistic churches, find ourselves in a tradition that is just never really been characterized by association at all. It's just been fiercely independent, in keeping with the Pacific Northwest. I think to the one group I want to say, independent, yes, fiercely, no, it is biblical to associate. It is biblical to cooperate. To the other group who find themselves in associations that don't really excite them very much because of what's being supported or not being supported, this is where ACME comes in. ACME, as I said, okay, let me just address the name. Yes, this was founded by a bunch of guys that grew up watching The Roadrunner in the 1970s. I am sorry. There it is. But it turns out that it's a wonderful acronym, Association of Churches for Missions and Evangelism. Next slide. ACME exists to unite and mobilize like-minded churches to fund pastors, church planters, missionaries, and other projects around the world. We want to unite churches, and we want to mobilize churches to the end of doing really good gospel work. How are we going to do that? Next slide. First, we've got to unite churches. And I think this is where it makes or breaks, right? Because if I'm in association with churches that are deeply like-minded with me, then I'm willing to lean in hard. But if I'm in association with churches that are like, I don't even know that I agree with them. I'm not even sure I could join that church down the street that I'm in association with. Then I'm not going to want to lean in very much. So our strategy is to bring churches together around 8 key distinctives. A commitment to expositional preaching, because we believe that God does his work through his word in a world gone awry. A commitment to historic Baptist ecclesiology. I don't want to plant Presbyterian churches. I used to be a Presbyterian. I'm not anymore, so I don't want to plant Presbyterian churches. I want to plant Baptist churches, and therefore I want to cooperate with others that are committed to that same historic Baptist ecclesiology. Third, Reformed soteriology. It is very difficult to do missions and evangelism with people that don't agree on how we are saved. Fourth, meaningful membership and discipline. We want to work together with churches that take the church seriously, that take what it means to gather people together and to call them to take responsibility for one another's lives together seriously, and are willing to actually say hard things, who are willing to practice church discipline even if when necessary. Elder-led congregationalism. I understand that might exclude some of you guys. But again, our conviction is that the more we are in alignment with each other, the more we will lean in together to cooperate and to really sacrificially give of our resources to get things done. One unified assembly. That's just the conviction that the church at its most basic level is a gathering. And if you got multiple gatherings, you got multiple churches. There are all sorts of reasons that churches might need to have multiple services for a season because they're in a building program or whatever. But as a philosophy of ministry, that's something that we're not interested in promoting. So this is an association of churches that are committed to the understanding that the gathering is the church. Biblically oriented public worship. What does this mean? It basically, it's a nicer way of saying the regulative principle of worship. We think that you cannot intuit from what I like to what God likes. That if I'm going to know what God likes, what really pleases him in worship, he's going to have to tell me. Because I can't start with me and what I enjoy to figure out what pleases him. And so we are going to be committed to an approach to worship that is driven by God's word. And then finally, church-centered missions and evangelism. God's strategy for reaching the world with the gospel is not more missionary agencies. God's strategy for reaching the world with the gospel is churches. You simply cannot send enough missionaries to reach the world. What you need are churches that are planted in their own language and in their own people who then do the work of planting more churches to see that part of the world reached. So a church-centered approach to missions and evangelism. Next slide. Second strategy for this. Not only do we want to unite churches, we want to gather churches into a family of fellowships. And the way we're doing that at the moment, this is just getting going, is an annual strategy conference. We will have our third such strategy conference. It'll be in Atlanta this year in May. But the point of this, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, the point of this is not a ministerial fellowship. We mean this to be an association of churches. There are other ministerial fellowships out there. Acts 29 is a really good example of a ministerial fellowship. There's no such thing as an Acts 29 church. They're just Acts 29 pastors because it's a pastor's fellowship. That's not us. We mean to be a fellowship of churches. And so we want to provide opportunities both nationally and regionally for churches to actually get together, get to know one another, encourage one another. Finally, we want to do all of this not just for the sake of kumbaya. We want to do this for the sake of getting really good stuff done for the gospel. So we want to lead churches who share these distinctives to share their resources together for Great Commission work. There are 5 different areas that Acme is making grants. I'm going to tell you more about those in just a minute. We are making grants to support pastors. There are all sorts of situations where a pastor is doing really good work but is in need of additional assistance. Second, planters and missionaries. We want to see churches planted domestically. We want to see missionaries sent out internationally. Properties. One of the great challenges for really good gospel work in certain places, you could think certain kind of urban places, one of the great challenges is a church being able to obtain a property where they could actually meet and have some control over. How many church plants have I been a part of over the years where the work is going great, but you're at the mercy of the local school district about whether or not you can even gather. So helping churches acquire properties. Pipelines, that's number 4. Those are any kind of training program, training ministry that is raising up pastors, like internships or missionaries that are like-minded on these 8 things. And then finally, projects, which is a bit of a catch-all, but so far has particularly focused on translation and media kind of resources. We're doing this because of what I said at the beginning, these 2 different problems that we see. Next slide. The sense of being alone. There may have been a time when our culture was much more friendly, that you could just be a lone church and on your own and doing your thing. But the more hostile our culture becomes, the more important it is that we are actually not all alone, but that we are part of a tribe, that we are part of a family, a fellowship of churches that have our back. The other issue then being disengagement, churches that have been a part of fellowships, but perhaps those fellowships, those historic relationships have grown wishy-washy, have grown theologically too broad to be meaningful. And we want to try to address both of these problems. Let's skip to, 1, 2, 3, 4 slides. Should look like that, yes. I do want you to know about our next annual strategy conference, because if this sounds like an association of churches that might be of interest to you, you should just come check us out. Our next meeting will be May 8 through 10, 2025 in Atlanta. All of the member churches will be there, but guests are more than welcome, and we would love to have you. Stephen Brucker, where's Stephen? Stephen's right here in the back. Stephen Brucker at South Hill Baptist Church is also an Acme Church member, along with Henson. Any other Acme churches here? I don't think so. Okay. So I would encourage you to talk to Stephen afterwards. Stephen's been to, have you been to all of the strategy conferences so far? Yeah. And would you agree with me that it's just a great thing to come to check us out? Yes. Okay, great. So I just want you to know about the specific dates there. Next slide. This is what we've been able to accomplish in 2 years. We have given out $900,000 in our first 2 years. What we ask of churches is to give between 2 to 4% of annual budget to the work of Acme. And that's aspirational. Almost no church can just come in at 2%. Most churches are needing to take time to work their way up there. But in just 2 years, with about 100 churches, we're right at 100 churches right now, we've been able to give away $900,000. 30% of it towards domestic church planting and projects, 70% of it to international mission work, all of which agrees with those 8 distinctives that I mentioned earlier. All of it, the kind of work that you would think, I would love my church to be a part of that. I would love to be able to stand up in front of my church and say, we helped make that happen. That's the kind of work that we intend to put in front of churches that are a part of Acme. Next slide. Yeah, if you're interested in Acme, you can go to our website, acmefellowship.org, to learn more. There's an interest form if you're interested in joining. That just starts a conversation. As I said, this is a fellowship of churches, so it actually requires your church to vote to join. You don't get to just decide it yourself. The church has to want to do this. And then, of course, Acme has to decide to take you in. So there's a vote on our side as well by the board. There are some other requirements. Your church has to be in agreement with the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy, the Danvers Statement on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, the Nashville Statement on Gender and Sexuality, New Hampshire Confession of Faith, 1853 revised, and a revised Together for the Gospel Statement of Affirmations and Denials. All of those documents are on the website, and you can look at it. You have to be able to affirm, not that your church has adopted all of those things, but that your church is in agreement with all of these things. Have I said we want to be like-minded? Yes, we want to be like-minded because we're convinced the more like-minded we are, the more we can do together. Now, that's Acme. I wasn't just asked to give you a pitch on Acme. Really, what I'm here to convince you of is whether it's Acme or some other association, just as it is fundamentally Christian to be in association with other Christians, we call those churches, so it is fundamentally Christian for churches to be in association with other churches for good gospel work. And I want to try to make the case that whether it's Acme or something else, you walk out of here more convinced than ever that you should be a part of such a like-minded association. And if the association you're in right now isn't like-minded and isn't allowing this kind of cooperation, find one that is. All right, I'm done. We've got a few minutes for questions. Let me get Stephen up here because he might be able to answer questions too about Acme. Any questions? Yes, sir. So the operational cost, that's a great question. I wish our executive director were here because he could give you the precise numbers. And so I don't want to, I'm on the board, but I'm not the finance guy, so I don't want to speak out of turn. But we have a staff of like 3, and 2 of them are part-time. The board consists of pastors like me, so we're a working board being paid by our churches. I believe we are giving, at the moment, we are giving somewhere around 90% of every dollar that comes in. Maybe it might even be closer to 95% away. We will not be able to do that forever. As the association grows, we're going to have to actually hire people. And so our overhead will go up, inevitably. But there is a strong commitment to keep the overhead as low as possible for as long as possible and just to push as much money out as we can. And as a result of that, our executive director has agreed to serve for yet another year unpaid. Well, I think he gets $5,000, so he gets a stipend. But he has other resources that are allowing him to do this for us. So it's a good question. And if you ask that question through the interest form, through the website, it'll get to somebody who can answer you with precise numbers. Any other questions? Nick.
You gave out 900,000. What are examples of that?
Yeah. Let me give it a start.
So one of the examples of the grant that actually our church, Southfield Baptist Church in Puyallup, we got a grant on behalf of Simeon Trust. Some of you, raise your hand if you know what Simeon Trust is. So we love what Simeon Trust is doing in raising up preachers, and it's one of the 8 distinctives, expositional preaching. And so our church filled out a grant application for Simeon Trust to fund a young man to do the Chicago course on preaching for a year in Chicago. And so that was funded, and our church got to meet, a few people got to meet the person who's now moving from Texas to Chicago to now train for a year and then, Lord willing, be sent out somewhere. And so we just thought, what a cool thing that our church got to participate in to fund that great work of training up a young man for
training up a young
preaching.
man, yeah. We have funded pastor training programs in Munich, Germany with Matthias Lohmann, in Dubai, UAE, with John Fulmer. We have funded pastor training and translation projects in South Africa, church planting efforts actually in a variety of places, including one here in the Pacific Northwest. We've already funded our first church planting effort in the Pacific Northwest up north of Bellingham. We have helped John Musimi get a church building in Nairobi. I'm pulling these off the top of my head because this last year we gave away something like 40 different grants. church planting in Sweden, church funding on-campus student ministry in Shanghai, China. That's actually not parachurch ministry. It's actually a consortium of local house churches that are working together to do student ministry on major university campuses in Shanghai, and we were able to come behind them and help to fund some of that work. So continue to be church-based as they reach out to students. I wish my PA, who is supposed to be here and who's in charge of all this, had not gotten the stomach bug this morning, because he could rattle them all off for you. But those are just some examples of different kinds of work that are going on. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Oh, my goodness. Yes. An elder-led Congregationalist. That would be me. Okay. Yeah, okay. Now, so elder-led Congregationalism would say that the Lord has established in the church a plurality of elders and entrusted those elders with authority, and that authority is to proclaim, thus saith the Lord. That authority is to lead. It is to shepherd. And the responsibility of the church is to listen to their elders and to follow their leaders. And yet at the same time, the Lord in the Scriptures has given final authority on some matters to the church as a whole. So we see in Matthew 18 that Jesus gives final authority for matters of discipline to the church. Jesus says in the final step of church discipline, he doesn't say tell it to the elders, he says tell it to the church, ecclesia, assembly. Now, I was a Presbyterian, so I know the argument. Oh, but the church is wherever the final authority is, the final authority is the elders. Yeah, fine. There is not a single person in the first century that would have understood it that way. That would have been nonsense to them. Ecclesia meant one thing and one thing only, and that's the assembly. It's a secular term that got pulled over in the translation of the Septuagint and then brought up into those sorts of religious contexts. So Jesus gave final authority for putting somebody out of the church to the church. Same for bringing people into the church. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul says, hey, that guy that you put out of the church, it worked. So you should bring him back in. Now, what's so interesting is he said that they put him out by vote of the majority, which, by the way, is a great proof text for membership, because you cannot have a majority of an indefinite, unknown number. They had to have known how many were in the church to be able to have a majority of something, right? So he says, by the same token, you put him out by vote of the majority, now you need to bring him back in. So there's responsibility for membership, bringing people in, that's given to the congregation. I would argue that Paul holds the churches responsible for their doctrine. When he writes the letter to Galatia, the churches of Galatia, he doesn't write it to the elders. He writes it to the churches. And he says, churches, you should have known better. And I'm holding you responsible for what you listen to. So doctrine, discipline, membership, and then finally leadership. I think you see that very clearly in Acts chapter 6. The apostles say to the church, you pick these guys out. We'll pray for them. We'll set them apart to the work, but you pick them out. And we'll give you the qualifications. You can't just pick anybody you want. We're going to give you some biblical qualifications for who you should pick, but you pick them out. The apostles didn't impose leadership on the church. They gave the responsibility to the church. So I would say that at least in those four areas, probably finances too, it's a little more complicated argument. We see in the New Testament that the church as a whole, as a gathered whole, has final authority. But what should that church do? It should listen to its elders. What should the elders do? It should lead them to exercise this authority well. So it's a working together of an authority of counsel, an authority of teaching, thus saith the Lord, and an authority of command. You're in, you're out, that work together for the health of the church. That, in a nutshell, is elder-led congregationalism.
Should we have an altar call?
All right. Okay. There are more hands. Are we good? Yes. So far. Our goal is 2/3 international, 1/3 domestic. That's our working goal. Other questions? Oh, that's right. If you go to acmefellowship.org, you can see kind of a summary, a picture and a summary of every single grant that we've made thus far. Thanks, Trevor. I think you'll find them encouraging. I know that for some of the churches that we've been involved with and some of the newer churches that come into Acme, one of the things that's so exciting, one of the things that's so difficult, particularly if you're a smaller church or you're not well connected, it can sometimes be hard to find something worth getting behind. Like you'd like to get behind really good work, but how do you even hear about it? How do you even know about it? This is something that Acme was designed for, because it's a collection of all sorts of different kinds of churches and sizes of churches, and any church can apply for a grant. In fact, you guys applied and got one, and we applied and did not get one, and I'm on the board. No, that's right.
Write better grants.
Write better grants. Write better grant proposals. But yeah, I mean, the beauty of this is it puts you as a member church in touch with really fantastic work that you might not ever have heard of otherwise. But now it's your work. If you're an Acme church, you get to own it and get to claim it, and actually have a pretty good chance of even having some of these folks be connected to your church, just like this guy came through. The point of Acme grants is never to fully fund a work. I mean, I know $900,000 seems like a lot of money in 2 years, but it is a drop in the bucket for what it really costs to make good work happen around the world. The point of the grants is to flag a work as worthy of a second look by member churches. We hope actually churches will take a look at these various projects and think, yep, some of our Acme dollars went there, but we've actually got some other funds over here in our missions budget and our church planning budget that we'd like to put towards this work as well, and really make it our own work. In one sense, it's a way of simply saying, out of the huge possibility of things you could do out here, here are 40 things, any one of which is worthy of any sort of missions or church planning money your church has.